Ministers at War by Jonathan Schneer continued. Disc 8. The chair of the second committee was William Beveridge, a former civil servant and former head of the London School of Economics, who was now Master of University College, Oxford. Ernest Bevin had appointed this distinguished and hugely ambitious figure to be an Under-Secretary in the Ministry of Labour in September 1940, but had quickly discovered him to be a difficult colleague. He attempted to get rid of his prickly, egocentric Under-Secretary by sending him to Arthur Greenwood, who at that point was still in charge of the Reconstruction Committee, to lead an inquiry requested by the trade unions on coordinating social services. Beveridge, refusing to be sidetracked, turned his new assignment into a broad-ranging survey of the social services deficiencies. His committee interviewed hundreds of witnesses and consulted many experts, including trade unionists and socialists. The result was that for the first time in his life, Beveridge, who had previously advocated social reform as a strategic and practical necessity for his country, now became fired up with a vision of social justice as an ethical ideal. Basically, he now believed what the HID had reported a majority of Britons believed: that for ethical as well as pragmatic reasons, government should and could guarantee full employment, and via generous welfare programs funded by state, employer and worker contributions, protect every Briton from cradle to grave against want, ignorance, squalor, and ill health. Even before he issued his report, Beveridge courted the limelight on the airwaves and in the press to publicize his views and maximize their impact. He intended to lift the lid on debate over post-war reconstruction that Churchill had been trying to clamp shut. While Beveridge was taking testimony and writing and polishing and publicizing, Conservatives grew uneasy. Tory backbenchers representing districts with coal, gas and electricity interests feared he would recommend nationalising them. MPs representing country districts hate it too warned the party chief whip, referring to Beveridge's prospective report. A committee of Tory diehards wrote a secret paper for Churchill attacking the idea of an even minimal interpretation of Social Security, arguing it was not the state's business to provide it. Rather, when the war was over, the government should first lower taxes and then get out of the way. They claimed that 90% of Conservative backbenchers supported them. Beveridge also worried Tory ministers, even those who were themselves reform-minded. R.A. Butler met him for dinner in August 1942. He said that we lived in revolutionary times, remembered Butler, who had become Minister of Education by then, and he proposed to make his contribution to the revolution. One cannot help being very nervous of Sir William Beveridge's views. Butler attempted to distinguish his own approach from that of his crusading dinner companion. We believe in leading up and not levelling down, in diversity and not in uniformity. Mounting anxiety about Beveridge affected even Churchill, who tore his gaze from Britain's overseas battlefields to focus momentarily on this uncongenial character and his unwelcome plans. The Prime Minister deemed Beveridge an awful windbag and a dreamer. He wrote to his Chancellor, "I hope you are giving full consideration to our post-war financial position. Nothing could be more dangerous than for people to feel cheated, because they had been led to expect attractive schemes, which turn out to be economically impossible." Kingsley Wood needed no such prompting. He assured Churchill that he intended to scrutinise Beveridge's cost projections, and that he would never let the government promise more than it could pay for. Then he told Butler that he hoped Beveridge would make as many high-minded and fantastic suggestions as possible, presumably because they would be easy to shoot down. Labour ministers feared Beveridge too, although for different reasons. Actually, one of them shared Conservative reasons. William Jowett, living down to Churchill's hopes for him, told the secretary of his committee, E. Bridges, that Britain could not afford expensive measures. He intended to submit to the Cabinet a document designed to show how bare the cupboard was. Among War Cabinet Labour ministers, Bevin, who disliked Beveridge personally, thought his proposed family allowances would undermine trade unions when they bargained for higher wages. He also thought Beveridge set employee contributions to Social Security too high. Mainly, however, he and Attlee and Morrison, who had just replaced Cripps in the War Cabinet, worried that Beveridge would create a political problem for them. They knew that the Labour Party as a whole would welcome a report that complemented its own views on Reconstruction, and that the Labour left would demand implementation at once as a first instalment of socialism. Conservatives, however, with whom they had to work in the coalition, would oppose. Labour ministers feared finding themselves caught in the middle. On November 16, 1942, the War Cabinet met to discuss the troublesome Don, the trumpet blast he intended to issue, and the political strife he would thereby provoke. Beveridge had announced his publication date for later in the month. Bevin objected to Beveridge trying to set the schedule. Shouldn't accept his date for publication. Tell him he presents and government decides publication. Then fix a different date. The War Cabinet agreed. It also instructed the Minister of Information, Brendan Bracken, to refuse Beveridge's request that he arrange a press conference to enable him to expound his report. Beveridge wanted to address House of Commons lobby correspondence. The War Cabinet decided he should be given no such opportunity. "Let us have a little order and discipline," Churchill expostulated. Kingsley Wood took the hardest line, quoting a recent headline in the Daily Telegraph against Beveridge. His politics placed him halfway to Moscow. 10 days later, the War Cabinet met again. Members now had before them copies of the Beveridge report, which had not yet been released to the public, with the issue no longer whether to let Beveridge promote the report and himself, but rather what their first impressions were of its contents. Party divisions immediately surfaced. Churchill. Cost. Wood. £100 million, immediate. Churchill. If we promise this largesse, far ahead of US standards, they may say, we are being asked to pay for this. Attlee. US reaction may be good. They may be impressed by our boldness. Churchill. Most serious reaction is on finance, rate of taxation. Wood. These recommendations must be considered in relation to claims of other services on the money available. Eden. Reminder, too, of necessary expenditure on armaments after the war. The non-party man, Anderson, also opposed the Beveridge report, but he worried about public reaction if the government simply rejected it. Could we not welcome it in principle? For the moment, his political antennae were more sensitive than those of his Conservative colleagues. The government finally allowed Beveridge to release the report on December 2. As many had feared, it created a sensation. Social Insurance and Allied Services became one of the most popular and well-read official publications in British history. 70,000 copies sold within a few days. All sides of the House of Commons clamoured to discuss it, Labour to express support, most Conservatives to express reservations. The War Cabinet scheduled a 3-day debate in the House to begin on February 16, 1943. But first, it had to define its own position. Jowett's committee would review the report and make suggestions, and Anderson would convey these to the War Cabinet for further discussion. And Churchill would miss almost all of it, in order to concentrate on what really interested him and on what he deemed the most important issue, the war. On January 12, 1943, he flew to Casablanca to meet Roosevelt. From there he travelled to Marrakesh, Cairo, Turkey, Cyprus, and Algiers. The purpose of the trip, he told the House of Commons on February 11, shortly after his return, had been to plan with various allies how to make the enemy burn and bleed in every way that is physically and reasonably possible. We may deduce that he had not spent much time considering the report by William Beveridge. And then he fell ill. A slight cold turned into pneumonia, and he took to his bed. In the weeks before the Beveridge report debate, Jowett's committee began to fashion a possible government response. Perhaps following Anderson's lead, it suggested welcoming most of Beveridge's proposals in principle, opening talks with relevant committees, but postponing any legislation until after the war. Meanwhile, in Churchill's absence, Attlee, as Deputy Prime Minister, presided over several difficult War Cabinet meetings. Agreement to follow Jowett's plan did not end discussion or reconcile differences. Labour and Liberal ministers wanted the government to accept Beveridge's main prescriptions now, even if without promising a date for implementation. Conservatives wanted to welcome them as a useful guide to reform and leave it at that. The War Cabinet of February 12 proved particularly contentious. "Children's allowances," mused Kingsley Wood about one of Beveridge's recommendations. "No hope to be extended of speedy introduction because of long time necessary to work out details. This applies to the scheme as a whole." Morrison, who favoured acceptance and prompt implementation, countered, "Inexpediency of grudging assent. If we are going to pay bill, we might as well get the credit for it," when Wood voiced another reservation. "We can't be committed on pensions." Archibald Sinclair, the Liberal, reiterated Morrison's point. "Spirit of announcement must endorse not only principles, but early action on these principles. Safest thing is to give House of Commons a firm lead." Wood remained unconvinced. Near the end of the meeting, he raised concerns about old age pensions specifically. "We must avoid increasing amounts for people who don't need them." Attlee provided Labour's answer. "Say impossible to define classes which are in no risk of ever needing social security. Administrative difficulties." Meanwhile, Churchill was in bed with a fever. That did not stop him from communicating about high strategy with Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the United States commanding general of the European theatre. General Bernard Montgomery, British commander of the 8th Army in North Africa, Marshal Stalin, and many others. Sick he might be, but he remained consumed by the task of making the enemy burn and bleed. Still, as the date of the House debate drew near, he found time to consider the Beveridge report more carefully. He did not think Britain could afford airy visions of utopia and El Dorado. At the same time, like Anderson, he recognized how popular the report had become. Therefore he approved the approach now recommended by Jowett: welcome, but don't commit. He wrote a memo pointing out that the current Parliament had been sitting since 1935, and therefore that it no longer represented the electorate and should not pass controversial legislation. Moreover, it was impossible to predict Britain's post-war financial situation. The coalition should get everything ready for the next Prime Minister and his government, and leave them a free hand to take up or reject a scheme. On February 15, he rose from his sickbed to preside over the last War Cabinet meeting before the Commons debate, and to put these arguments to the Cabinet Ministers. This meeting proved even more contentious than the last one had been. Attlee met Churchill's first point head-on. During World War I, an older Parliament than the one currently sitting had passed important bills. If PM's line is taken, it will provoke demand for general election. He half feared that was Churchill's intention. Despite the HID report indicating a popular swing to the left, and despite the popularity of Beveridge's scheme, which Labour supported and most Conservatives opposed, all the Labour ministers thought they would lose a general election if one took place. They could not imagine that the country would vote against Winston Churchill's party. But that meant, in the final analysis, that all Churchill had to do in an argument with them was stand fast. Still, Attlee and his socialist colleagues put up a fight. The Labour Party leader had produced a cogently argued response to Churchill's memo. At the War Cabinet meeting, he and his allies repeated its main arguments. Attlee: you can't make plans even without reaching some decisions. Churchill: no promises, no commitments, every conceivable preparation. Attlee: preparations all involve decisions of policy. Churchill: I would agree to legislation by this Parliament to prepare for post-war, but not to legislation taking decisions binding the future. Morrison: if we accept the view that we can have no enabling legislation dealing with post-war problems, we shall be in an indefensible position. Churchill: I don't mean to ban legislation enabling you to make preparations. Wood: we don't propose to say this week that we shall introduce legislation. Because Churchill had placed Anderson in charge of committees dealing with the home front, Anderson would speak first for the government in the debate the next day. He sought clarification on Wood's point. What I want to know is whether I am to say that legislation will not be proposed to this Parliament. Although the National Liberal Ernest Brown answered Anderson, that would be fatal, and the minutes record that Minister of Labour Bevin and others agreed. Churchill and Wood had their way. Anderson would not promise legislation to introduce any aspect of the Beveridge Report. Parliament convened 24 hours later to consider the following motion, approved by the War Cabinet and introduced by Arthur Greenwood, who had now returned to the back benches, but was still Labour's deputy leader. That this House welcomes the report of Sir William Beveridge on social insurance and allied services as a comprehensive review of the present provisions in this sphere, and as a valuable aid in determining the lines on which developments and legislation should be pursued as part of the government's policy of post-war reconstruction. When he rose to state the government's position, Anderson ploddingly followed instructions. A time will come when difficult decisions will have to be taken. The time for such decisions is not yet. He may have been a superb committee man, as Eden judged, but he could not hold the House of Commons. A Labour member shouted, "It is not much use listening to him." This individual had concluded already that the government was stalling, and that Labour Party leaders who were accepting the government line had betrayed their followers. Socialist backbenchers interrupted continually from this moment on. They maintained a rowdy accompaniment, while Pomposo tried to speak. At one point, a Conservative member rose on a point of order. "There are some of us who want to hear this speech, but there is a continual muttering going on the whole time from the opposition benches." Yet the unruliness was not confined to one side of the House. A Labour member wrote bitterly in his diary that night that Anderson had spoken to a running and approving murmur of Tory die-hard cheers, that the government would shelve the whole matter. Newspapers the next morning recorded an acute political crisis. Tories, who feared explicitly opposing Beveridge's wildly popular plan, accepted the government motion, since it committed to nothing, but Labour backbenchers intended to table an amendment demanding implementation of Beveridge's scheme as quickly as possible, even during wartime. Liberals and some dissident Tories would join them. It would be the biggest parliamentary rebellion since May 1940. At a closed-door meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party, Attlee and Morrison unavailingly urged the rebels to drop the amendment. They found themselves precisely where they didn't want to be, between their own party on the left and their Conservative ministerial colleagues to the right, and unable to shift either side. The War Cabinet convened a little later that day with the ideological divide between Socialists and Conservatives widening perilously. When Attlee and Morrison reported on the unsatisfactory conclusion to their recent meeting, Wood merely reiterated that the government was following proper procedure. It would welcome the report, consult with appropriate committees, and prepare legislation. Churchill reiterated that the War Cabinet must confine itself to matters raised by the war. Implementation of Beveridge's recommendations would depend upon Britain's financial position when the war was over. Tempers flared. Attlee: "We didn't come into this government on basis only of dealing with war. We always understood that we would concern ourselves with preparations for post-war problems. Moreover, the public are very much interested in their post-war conditions. This government must either govern or get, through a general election, a government that will." Labour members complained that the government had paid only lip service to the report. Morrison seemed to demonstrate, to the contrary, that the government accepted and believed in it, the reforms it already had accepted in principle, and that he had just listed proved that. He explained the need for consultation before implementation in a manner beyond the parliamentary skills of the civil servant Anderson or Chancellor Wood. "This is a country in which if you do things without giving reasonable opportunities for consultation with the persons who are affected, they will be very cross and there will be trouble. I speak feelingly. I was accused of not consulting my trade union friends when I brought in the compulsory fire prevention order, on which I was in rather a hurry, because the country was in danger of burning down. But they complained, and not without justification entirely, that they had not been consulted. A member asked whether, after consultations, the government would undertake to bring in the necessary legislation. Morrison did not prevaricate. "I was coming to that. All these preparations lead up to the preparation of the bill or bills. I cannot go further than what has been said. We cannot give a date when the bill will be produced, but we are going to lose no essential time, subject to the prior claim on our labours, which is the successful prosecution of the war." He had not contradicted Anderson and Wood, but most of his audience thought he had, if only implicitly. When he concluded that the government has acted with speed, we have reached among ourselves reasonable agreement with a big progressive outcome, a majority of Labour members decided that the government favoured Beveridge's recommendations and would implement them as soon as it could, possibly before the war was over. They would vote for the amendment. They could hardly do otherwise. But only a few on the far left would want to press the rebellion further. The Home Secretary had rehabilitated not only the government in their eyes, but the Labour Party leadership too, at least for the time being. Herbert Morrison had delivered a bravura parliamentary performance. Everyone knew it and said so. This success built the confidence of a man who had not lacked it to begin with. It fed his ambition. If before delivering the speech he had stood not quite on a par with other Labour ministers in the War Cabinet, he did so now. Increasingly, the Prime Minister would have to take him into account. And the debate over Britain's post-war future was only just beginning. Chapter 11. The Cocky Cockney and the debate over post-war Britain. The run-up to the House debate over the Beveridge report, capped by the debate itself, marked a watershed in British wartime politics. Previously, discussion of post-war reconstruction had been relatively muted, at least in comparison with what was to come. From then on, it grew ever more intense, culminating in the claims and counterclaims of the general election of 1945. This was not Beveridge's doing alone. By the end of 1942, the tide of war had turned, with Allied victories at Stalingrad in Russia, El Alamein in North Africa, and Guadalcanal in the South Pacific. Britain no longer seemed likely to lose. But that meant that, much though Churchill might want to, he could no longer dismiss concern about the shape of post-war Britain as a mere distraction. The realistic prospect of victory, however distant, legitimised serious discussion of the shape of things to come. From the autumn of 1942 until the lead-up to the general election, the man who most often and most tellingly put Labour's case for socialist reconstruction was Herbert Morrison. During the debate on the Beveridge Report, he had stepped firmly, not merely onto the national stage, but to its very centre. Afterward, he stayed there, an easily recognisable figure with his one blind eye, his rumpled suits, his untamable quiff of hair. During the interwar period, politically conscious Britons had already known him as a dominant figure in London politics. He had served as a borough councillor and mayor, building a powerful political machine in London, leading it to victory on the London County Council in 1934, and had then demonstrated what municipal socialism could mean by unifying all London transport under a single municipal authority, the London Passenger Transport Board. Britons also knew him as a leader in the National Labour Party, for which he represented South Hackney in the House of Commons. He had played a prominent part in framing Labour's socialist programme, which he tried to design to appeal to all classes, not only the working class. He served on the party's most important committees, always emphasising practical measures as incremental steps toward the great goal, and advocating public corporations, such as the London Transport Board, as the best form of government control. Finally, he had a reputation for being reasonable and democratic, and for being an effective administrator. He listened carefully, asked intelligent questions, drew the logical conclusions, and acted on them swiftly. Some in the Labour Party distrusted him, however. The Labour left believed that his Fabian version of socialism, with its emphasis on government boards, represented a top-down approach and provided no scope for democratic input from workers on the shop floor. A powerful contingent of trade unionists nursed more visceral suspicions. They believed, probably correctly, that while Morrison was Minister of Transport in Ramsay MacDonald's second Labour government, his ambitions had nearly trumped his principles. In 1931, with the economic depression at its worst and the government divided over what to do, Morrison, said his doubters, had wanted to stick with the Prime Minister, who was about to dissolve the Cabinet, form a national government composed mainly of Conservatives, and then call a general election and campaign against his own party for a doctor's mandate to fix things, mainly by cutting government spending. But MacDonald, they said, wouldn't have him. Ernest Bevin led this contingent of doubters. He deemed Morrison an irremediably slippery character. When Morrison stood for leadership of the Labour Party in 1935, Bevin and his trade union allies made sure Attlee would beat him. As a result, Morrison could not hope to dominate the Parliamentary Labour Party, as he had dominated the Labour contingent on the London County Council, but he continued to nurse his ambitions, and so far he always had realised them, sooner or later. In May 1940, Churchill enabled Morrison to take a giant step in that direction by choosing him to be Minister of Supply, and then 6 months later, Home Secretary. The second appointment, which took place at the height of the London Blitz, proved crucial. The Prime Minister recognised that this quintessential London man, this cocky Cockney, although since he had been born in South London, not East London, he wasn't a Cockney, strictly speaking, could best organise the capital's civil defence, just as he had organised London's municipal services and transportation providers before the war. He thought also that Morrison could best represent the great city to the government, and the government to the city, and that he could do for Britain's provincial cities what he could do for the capital. Events proved Churchill right. Wherever the Germans bombed, there soon appeared Herbert Morrison, offering sympathy to the survivors, listening judiciously to their complaints and recommendations, promising quick action, fulfilling his promises. He worked hard and successfully to improve London's bomb shelters, to open new ones deep underground, to systematize access to them, and to improve their amenities. By the spring of 1941, wrote his biographers, most Londoners sheltering underground were sleeping in reasonably civilized dormitories. He also ordered production of indoor shelters, which eventually became known as Morrisons, for people who preferred to stay at home when the bombs fell. He established fire watchers to assist fire brigades and nationalized the fire brigades. He responded with equal flair, compassion, and organizational skills throughout the country, and by the end of his tenure in the position, he had reorganized Britain's entire civil defense system, making it infinitely more efficient than it had been before. In November 1942, Churchill promoted him to the War Cabinet. He commended Morrison's courageous and resourceful leadership at a rally in Hyde Park, and the people cheered. Within the Labour Party, only some powerful trade unionists and a few on the left continued to nourish suspicions and resentments of him. Morrison took his place in the War Cabinet, sitting at the right end of the oval table, with Eden to his left, and Bevan, whose dislike had not abated over the years, but rather ripened into loathing, to the left of Eden. Churchill sat on the other side, between Attlee and a secretary. Years later, Eden reported to an interviewer that whenever Morrison spoke at these meetings, Bevan would provide a sotto voce accompaniment of jibes and taunts. He found sitting between the two men rather uncomfortable. Morrison heard Bevan, but never responded. Hurt and offended he must have been, but it did not deter him. He proved as effective in the War Cabinet as he had been everywhere else. Morrison was certainly not reticent or shy, Eden remembered. He was always well briefed and put his case well. By late 1942, the Home Secretary had his department running smoothly. He judged that with Russia and America now in the war, Britain would win, and he knew that Beveridge would soon release his report. Morrison never neglected his many duties as Home Secretary, or for the Labour Party, but finally he felt able to turn his mind to post-war problems. In December, he launched a series of speeches on this subject. 2 months before the Beveridge Report debate, he already was answering Conservatives who judged that a welfare state would be too expensive, arguing in a speech in Swindon, for example, that a cautious, niggling worldly wisdom, counting chances while children went hungry, would be a miserable foundation for our future life together as a family. 3 days before Commons debated the Beveridge plan, he went further in a speech at Nottingham. The government already had agreed, for practical reasons, to maintain some price controls during the transition to peace. Morrison wanted much more. Rationing in appropriate forms for the sake of fairness at home, and for the sake of keeping the ship of state on an even keel. We must have raw material controls too. We shall also want price control. In this manner, he predicted, Britain would contain the forces of selfishness and sectionalism. Meanwhile, the party leader Attlee had his hands full, not only with government work, but also with managing his disputatious party and colleagues. He largely remained quiet about post-war matters. Bevan, rude though he might be to Morrison, had been schooled in loyalty by the Union. Heeding Churchill's exhortations not to rock the coalition, he too avoided visionary speeches about reconstruction. So by and large did Cripps during this period. His moment in the sun was temporarily eclipsed. The result was that when Morrison rose to defend the government in the debate on Beveridge's report, he already had a reputation, not merely as a successful and popular Home Secretary, but also as a Labour War Cabinet Minister, most willing to voice his party's aspirations for the future. When he then satisfied Labour MPs that the government would implement Beveridge's proposals as soon as it could, he further cemented that reputation. This placed him well for future efforts. Obviously, it also put him in a position to advance his career. He would soon be doing both. And what about Winston Churchill at this time? After February 15, when he chaired the last war cabinet before the Beveridge Report debate, he returned to his bed, sick with pneumonia, temperature rising dangerously to 102 degrees. Nevertheless, except for an interlude during which he read Moll Flanders, his illness did not stop him from composing and dispatching one memo or letter after another to generals, diplomats, dictators, presidents, prime ministers, and King George VI. His correspondence ranged over the Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, now scheduled for June, the ongoing campaign in North Africa, the great battles raging in Russia, Gandhi's hunger strike in India, and the Free French in West Africa. Then, a gentleman, Mr. Thompson, kindly presented me with a lion. Churchill made sure the zoo could take it. I do not want the lion at the moment either at Downing Street or at Chequers, owing to the ministerial calm which prevails there. But the zoo is not far away, and situations may arise in which I shall have great need of it. In his multi-volume history of World War II, the chapter dealing with this period mentions all of the above, and not a word about Beveridge. However, Churchill did receive a letter from Beveridge around this time, and wrote a brief reply on the first day of the debate. Thank you. I hope an opportunity for a talk with you will occur in the future, but of course I have to give my main attention to the war. He could not ignore entirely the issues Beveridge finally had succeeded in raising, however. Lying on his sickbed, he received a verbal report about the debate from his PPS. The Conservative chief whip sent him a breakdown of the government's House supporters and opponents. Among Liberal MPs, all but 3 had voted for the amendment to the government motion. Aside from Labour's ministers and their subordinates, practically the entire parliamentary Labour Party had done the same. Only the Conservatives had supported the government motion unamended, and Churchill knew what most of them really thought of Beveridge. The vote for the amendment to the government motion proved to be the biggest parliamentary rebellion during his premiership. Churchill finally realised he would have to publicly address the subject of post-war reconstruction after all. Here was a crucial moment in Churchill's premiership, although it is rarely treated as one. It was the moment when he might have taken hold of the growing movement for far-reaching post-war reconstruction. But that would have required recognizing the extent of the groundswell then taking place, accepting its sweeping aims, or at least many of them, and carrying a majority of his party with him. Churchill only partially grasped the extent of this upsurge, and at heart he neither sympathized with nor accepted its aims. He simply did not believe in many government controls. He was not much interested in post-war reconstruction, and he continued to deem its most enthusiastic partisans woolly-minded idealists. Still, Churchill knew he had to do something. When he was well enough to go to Chequers on March 3, he began working on a speech. He wrote a draft while sitting in the bathtub, working the taps with his toes. He would rise from the tub and stride across his room naked, except for a bath towel, reciting portions of it. On March 11, he summoned R.A. Butler to discuss it, especially the section on education. Butler, in his account of the visit, made clear that it was a version of the address on post-war reconstruction that Churchill would deliver over the radio 9 days later. Recovered from his illness, Churchill went on air on the evening of March 20, 1943. He began by assuring listeners, perhaps not altogether accurately, that when he had been ill, he nevertheless had followed attentively all the time what was happening in Parliament and the lively discussions on our home affairs when peace comes. He took a page from the book of Herbert Morrison, whose speech he undoubtedly had read. Nothing would be easier for me than to make any number of promises and to get the immediate response of cheap cheers and glowing leading articles. I am resolved not to. But he did not want to co-opt and redirect the groundswell of left-wing opinion in the country. So he announced a 4-year plan. He announced that he supported creation of a national health service. He said he favored higher education for anyone capable of benefiting from it, and full employment, and maintenance of price controls for a period of transition after the war. As for social security, you must rank me and my colleagues as strong partisans of national compulsory insurance for all classes, for all purposes, from the cradle to the grave. At first blush, this seems hard to distinguish from what Labour supporters wanted. Arthur Greenwood probably spoke correctly when he said at the Labour Party conference a year later, "The Prime Minister's broadcast flabbergasted a lot of British listeners." Some thought the speech recalled the days before World War I, when as a Liberal, Churchill had worked with David Lloyd George to establish Britain's first social insurance programmes. There may be some truth in this. A close reading of the speech, however, suggests a different conclusion, that it was an elaborate exercise in fobbing off. Churchill spoke of post-war reform, but he provided no details and avoided contentious matters. When he came to the National Health Service, for example, he did not mention whether it would abolish private hospitals and private medical practices, as many in the Labour Party wanted. When he spoke of education, he did not mention abolition of educational class privilege in the public schools, that is, the historically private independent schools, such as Eton, his own alma mater, Harrow, and the like, again as Labour advocated. When he spoke of full employment, he said that the state would plan for it, but also that private enterprise must play its part to the utmost. As for post-war controls, he did no more than repeat government policy. There should be controls on some prices during the transitional period from war to a peacetime economy. Moreover, he unmistakably distinguished his approach from that of the socialists. Our people will be the last to consent to be governed by a bureaucracy. Freedom is their lifeblood. Most importantly, he continued to insist, as he had done at the War Cabinet before the debate on Beveridge's proposals, that no plan, not even his own, would be implemented until Germany had been beaten and a new government elected in Britain to assess the financial situation. It seems clear that Churchill wanted to be associated in the public mind with the extraordinarily popular Beveridge plan, but without alienating the base of the Conservative Party, and without denying his own convictions. He went as far as he could, but it was not far enough in the eyes of many. His main motive was not to outline schemes of post-war reconstruction, but rather to simplify and mollify political divergences and enable all our political forces to march forward to the main objective in unity, and so far as possible, in step. To the War Cabinet he said, "Last thing I want is endless buzz of ardent discussion of post-war problems." But he had not said enough to quiet the buzz. If anything, the buzz grew louder and more intense. Indeed, it grew loud even inside the Parliamentary Conservative Party, PCP. In April, shortly after Churchill's speech, Tory right-wingers founded a National League for Freedom, NLF. This organisation argued that all government intervention leads inevitably to totalitarianism, a view famously encapsulated 1 year later in Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Members may have feared that Churchill was travelling down that road. In 1944, one would cite Hayek in a letter to him. Anyone who has read Professor Hayek's book will realize the danger of the tendency towards more and more state control. The immediate purpose of the NLF, as it announced in the introduction to its first pamphlet, was to fight the growing threat to British liberty represented by the host of government officials who today shut down businesses, pry into private affairs, issue endless forms, and are slowly strangling not only trade, but liberty. Its members utterly opposed Beveridge's schemes and Churchill's gestures toward them, half-hearted though these gestures may have been. They wanted to roll back government controls as soon as the war ended. Probably they represented majority opinion within the PCP, if not within the Conservative Party as a whole. Some younger Tory MPs welcomed Beveridge's report, however. These members, consisting of about 40 men, most of them relatively young, told Churchill's PPS that a Conservative minister of their generation, R.A. Butler, for instance, would have better represented the government in the Beveridge report debate than Kingsley Wood had. Then they tabled a motion requesting the appointment of a Minister of Social Security to prepare the legislation Beveridge had adumbrated. The day before Churchill broached his 4-year plan, they set up their own permanent committee, the Tory Reform Group, TRG. They believed that Conservatives who opposed Beveridge's proposals were committing political suicide. In their initial press announcement, they claimed that social reform is a tradition which the Conservative Party desires to see maintained. The TRG began releasing bulletins dealing with current political questions, for example on land and agriculture, on coal, and on employment policy. It advocated a Tory middle road. These members did not think the Prime Minister was taking it. Churchill's radio address did not even quiet his Conservative colleagues in government. Butler was buzzing about education, which Churchill had set him onto, thinking it would divert him from demanding sweeping reforms in other realms. Eden had said well before Beveridge released his report that social security must be the first object of our domestic policy after the war. Now he was saying, if we imagine that all controls can be swept aside, or that we can return to the economic anarchy of the old days, then we shall bring not only discredit, but disaster upon ourselves. Even Lord Beaverbrook was buzzing about plans for Britain after the coming victory. That old buccaneer had produced a characteristically brash and blunt outline of the post-war Conservative reforms he favoured just before the debate on Beveridge. He opposed socialism, but recognised there could be no going back to 1939. He advocated a paternalistic capitalism, with state-sponsored public housing and public health as well as co-education and abolition of public schools. Labour of every type attaching to a factory, he wrote in a memorandum, becomes a charge on it, and must take precedence over every other form of charge. Now and henceforth the first charge shall be the labourer instead of the shareholder. He sent a copy of this memo to a more representative figure in the party than himself, the chairman of the 1922 committee. "Is it the suggestion," asked this gentleman, aghast at Beaverbrook's last proposal in particular, "that a firm should employ 600 workmen where 500 will do?" Undeterred, Beaverbrook composed a short statement reiterating his main points. The programme is not socialism. The programme is not fascism. Nor is it a return to pre-war conditions. Industry must take the responsibility. He was recommending a new capitalism which will provide for production and consumption expanding as fast as daring and initiative can provide the way. The Minister of Food, Lord Woolton, a non-party figure who would join the Conservatives immediately after the war, contributed to the buzz as well. Nationalisation, private enterprise. What do these things matter to the old man in the street? He wanted to know. Like the TRG, he advocated a middle road for Conservatives to follow. By means of private enterprise or by means of government action, Britain should, after the war, provide houses for the people of this country so that they may live decently. It should put a floor into wages and into conditions of employment, so that whilst employers shall gain their freedom to make what they like and what they can sell, only such people as are worthy of respect as employers shall be able to employ labour in the commercial world. He asked, If we license public houses, i.e. pubs, is there any reason why we should not license employers and premises so that Labour may know which employers have prescribed to a standard for the rest? Unlike Eden and Butler, who knew their political futures lay with the Conservative Party, no matter how frustrating it sometimes seemed to them, Woolton may have briefly flirted with the idea of leading a separate centrist party. He sent a copy of his speech to a former member of the board of directors of Lewis Department Stores, on which he too had served as chairman for 4 years before the war, and told him he planned to deliver 3 more addresses. This man, who recently had started a conservative research centre for progressive Tories, advised against publishing the speech until autumn, by which time Woolton should have the next 3 clear in his mind. Then, you come out and nail your colours firmly to the mast. This speech is your entry into politics as a leader of a centre party. You are setting the stage admirably. Woolton duly addressed the TRG. His former colleague wrote, "A compact little group of 50 MPs with an organisation behind them might be of use to you." Did Churchill think that his Minister for Food was buzzing too loudly? Perhaps wanting to nip a potential threat in the bud, but more likely realising that his hopes for quieting debate had failed, and wishing to appeal at least to advocates of moderate renewal, he appointed Woolton in November 1943 to a newly created post, Minister of Reconstruction, with a seat in the War Cabinet. He had thought first of appointing Beaverbrook, but Labour ministers rose up in opposition. Once in his new post, the former Minister of Food abandoned his dreams of leadership, without telling his friend from Lewis Department Stores, who inspired a series of articles, puffing him in the provincial press. The embarrassed Woolton disavowed them, and his friend, in an obsequious letter to the Prime Minister. But he still believed in the middle road. 2 days after his promotion, he had a long session with the same chairman of the 1922 committee, whom Beaverbrook had outraged. More in sorrow than in anger, he tried to indicate to this gentleman where the Conservative Party was going wrong. I asked him to consider whether, as a party, they agreed with me in the steps that I had taken to preserve infant health, by making milk readily accessible to all nursing mothers, by insisting that those simple luxuries of the rich, such as orange juice and cod liver oil, which have caused rickets to disappear from the nurseries of the well-to-do, were not an equal necessity for the children of the poor. I pointed out that in none of these things, simple and humble as they are, have the Conservative Party ever raised a voice in the House of Commons by way of support. He laid out the moderate path he thought Conservatives should follow with regard to trade unions and regulation of industry and conditions of employment. What the 1922 committee chairman thought is unrecorded. Perhaps not much. R.A. Butler deemed the committee head too stupid to do anything but intrigue. As for Labour, its rank and file now was buzzing louder than ever. But Churchill had the Labour ministers on a hook. They cherished socialist goals as much as the rank and file did, but they also believed in the coalition. They thought Churchill would yank the hook if they pushed their programme too hard, dissolving the coalition and calling a general election, which the Conservatives would win. By and large, they held their tongues in public about the shape of things to come, except for Herbert Morrison. He had no doubt that a Labour minister should boldly call for more than his socialist colleagues dared to, and for far more than middle-of-the-road Tories and Churchill were. In speeches he delivered prior to the debate on the Beveridge report, Morrison had indicated what he thought Labour's post-war policy should be. After the debate, he continued in the same vein, only more sharply and in more detail. During the months after the debate, the cocky Cockney cemented his reputation as the voice of Labour's socialism with a series of hard-hitting addresses. On May 3, 1943, he told an audience in Birmingham that his party always had favoured the measures Beveridge now proposed. Finally, the Liberals had come round, and so had the Conservatives, by voting to welcome Beveridge's proposals. Therefore, the real question today is the great issue of the relation between the state and industry. Labour must win this argument too. It must persuade the country that the state should find some means, by public ownership or some form of public control, to ensure that centrally organised industries are operated in the interest of expanding national wealth and a policy of full employment. Without Labour victory in this argument, there would be no public ownership. Without public ownership, there could be no full employment. And without full employment, predicted Morrison, Beveridge and a whole lot of other things would in the end go down the drain. Possibly somebody told Morrison to ratchet back after this speech. If so, he refused. But he seemed to be answering someone when he said, 6 days later in a speech at Bromwich, "So long as we keep things in the right perspective, I believe that this concern about the future does not hinder, but rather helps the prosecution of the war." Then he returned to his central message. Control has helped to get maximum production in war. It has helped to solve problems of prices and wages. It will have to help solve many of the very similar problems that will face us after the war. The choice will be between control and chaos. Morrison had a talent for putting complex matters into language all could understand. In this same speech, he warned his audience not to be fooled by people who tell you that we have fought the war for freedom and that the irksome restrictions and regulations and control that the war has brought should be completely done away with. He was preempting a likely conservative argument. Now, what do you think would happen if we took off all the controls? There would be a mad scramble with everyone competing against everyone else. Prices would go skyrocketing up. The man with the long purse would do the best for himself. The rich man would get his motor car before the poor housewife got her new pots and pans. The millionaire would get his mansion before the bombed-out docker got his new house. Some of the key requirements of government and industry would be delayed far longer than they ought to be. This was the kind of argument that Labour supporters were longing to hear. Unlike Winston Churchill, Herbert Morrison was not merely paying lip service to the groundswell. He identified heart and soul with its desire for a radically reconstructive post-war Britain. He returned to the charge at Dundee a few weeks later. "We shall have won this war by a system of fair shares, which means control, by a system of finding what we needed wherever we could get it, which means control, by a system of allotting our resources to the most urgent need on a basis of first things first, which means control. All these things will be needed after the war." In London, he gave a speech called "A Restatement of Some Socialist Principles," in which he attempted to work out a right relation between the state and industry. He favoured socialisation of centralised business, of monopolies, cartels, and all other enterprises that had power over public well-being and public policy, but not of small businesses, which pay a real social dividend. In fact, characteristically, he assured small business owners that under a Labour government there would be a good deal of business activity carried on among us without state operation or control. This was vintage Morrison, attempting to reassure the useful classes, as he called them, that socialism would not hurt them, that the new economic order would be in their interest too, not just in the interests of the industrial proletariat. Morrison said only what he believed. He wanted Britain to become a more just, humane, and egalitarian country, and he believed that socialism would make it so. He wanted his party to state this unambiguously. But also, he wanted to become its leader and eventually Prime Minister. When he gave these speeches, he raised his profile and positioned himself for the coming struggle for leadership. And of course he knew it. By mid-1943, observe his biographers, no other figure in the Labour movement so symbolised the will to make sure that it was Labour which shaped Britain's post-war destiny. Attlee did not yet perceive Morrison as a threat, but Ernest Bevin, who remained steadfastly loyal to both Attlee and Churchill, did. He determined to puncture Morrison's balloon. He got his chance soon after January 1943, when Morrison arranged to be nominated for Treasurer of the Labour Party. Morrison hoped this position would serve as a springboard to the leadership, if not now, then after the next general election, which he thought would be followed by a ballot for party leader. It came as a blow, therefore, when Arthur Greenwood threw his hat into the ring too. Greenwood's colleagues at the top knew, as Hugh Dalton put it in his diary, that the poor old chap couldn't even sign his name after midday. But he remained popular in the Labour Party as an old warhorse whom Churchill had treated shabbily. Still, Morrison thought that he could beat Greenwood in a straight fight. But then a third candidate, nominated by the Miners' Union, appeared as well. At the Labour Party annual conference in June 1943, where the election would take place, politicking grew intense. Morrison had the support of the vast majority of delegates from local branches of the Labour Party. His allies trawled for votes among trade union leaders, not without success. But the third candidate divided the anti-Greenwood vote, and then at the crucial moment, Bevin delivered the coup de grace by throwing the block vote of his massive Transport and General Workers' Union behind Greenwood, ensuring the latter's victory and Morrison's defeat. The Home Secretary took his loss hard, but he remained at the height of his powers and irrepressible. Within a week he was back out on the stump. Tinkering and patching with our social system is not good enough. The basic question is who will control industry. He exhorted another London audience. He had picked himself up and started in all over again, redoubling his efforts as Labour's boldest spokesman for post-war socialism. The setback, he must have assured himself, would be only temporary. Meanwhile, Churchill had a war to run. On May 4, 1943, he set off aboard the Queen Mary for the United States for further military discussions. Amazingly, William Beveridge had booked passage on the same ship. Churchill could not avoid inviting him to lunch. So the two men finally had a chance to talk about the famous Beveridge report after all. It did not go well. Churchill's doctor recorded in his diary, "When the PM summoned to his table an acquaintance in whom he had little interest, a few words would be exchanged. After that, though, Churchill would make no further attempt at conversation, sitting all hunched up and scowling at his plate, with his thoughts a long way off." In this particular instance, the doctor concluded, "At about 2:30, the bleak little function just petered out." Churchill addressed the U.S. Congress on May 20 to thunderous applause. A week later, he headed for Africa for discussions about the campaign there and the need for a quick, decisive victory over Italy. He did not return to Britain until June 5. Then in August, he set sail again, this time for the now famous Quebec Conference, where at last serious planning for Operation Overlord, the second front in France, would take place. From Quebec, he travelled again to Washington, D.C., for further discussions. This time he did not get back to London until September 20, and then he would be off for Cairo and for a conference in Tehran with FDR and Stalin in November. Meanwhile, nervous or angry conservatives who hated what Morrison advocated kept complaining about him. When Churchill got home, in addition to all his other concerns, he had to juggle these men and finally Morrison too. The Home Secretary's speech in Dundee on the necessity of post-war controls had agitated conservatives. One of them gave notice that he intended to raise a question in the House of Commons. Did Morrison speak for the government? Churchill, perhaps comparing his rapturous reception by Congress in Washington to the troublesome Parliament in London, got Morrison on the telephone. "Why are you so provocative? Why do you put me in a jam like this?" Morrison told a journalist, "We had a hell of an up and down about it." He added, "But it was all in quite good humour." Perhaps so, or maybe not. In the House, Churchill quoted Kingsley Wood, reminding Conservatives that even that orthodox Chancellor once had said that a considerable measure of control of our economic life will have to continue after the war. Then Churchill spoke his mind. In a national coalition formed to carry on the war, a certain diversity of opinion, or at least of emphasis, is indispensable to political sincerity. I earnestly hope, however, that party controversy will be avoided. This is a time when all combative impulses should be reserved for the enemy. It was hardly an endorsement of his minister, and yet that did not satisfy his minister's critics. Another Tory raised his voice. Will the right honourable gentleman consider suggesting to the Home Secretary that he should join the National League for Freedom? Nor, in fact, was Churchill himself satisfied. He thought a speech here or there was one thing, but that a series of them on a central theme, which he now realized Morrison had delivered, amounted to a campaign. Moreover, he did not sympathize with the campaign. He took the Home Secretary aside. This time, the two men rowed. Morrison reported to another Labour minister, "Hitherto the PM has not minded my speeches on post-war control at all, but now he is angered by them." This did not stop Morrison from continuing to make them, however, or from continuing to make trouble for the Prime Minister in other ways. This audiobook is continued on Disc 9.